Elena Volkov had been told by her uncle, her cousins, and even her own father to stop pretending she was rich, to stop putting on airs, to accept that she was just a regular person with a regular job who needed to stop acting like she belonged in circles she could never truly access. But what none of them knew, what she had kept hidden with meticulous care for nearly a decade, was that she had the liquidity to buy their family's manufacturing company 3 times over without making a meaningful dent in her portfolio. What would you do if your own family spent years mocking success they couldn't see? The Volkov family had immigrated to Pennsylvania from Russia in the early 90s, when Elena was just 3 years old and the Soviet Union was collapsing into history. Her grandfather Dmitry had worked in a metals factory in Chelyabinsk, and when he arrived in Pittsburgh, he had found work in the same industry, bringing the skills that had sustained him through one world into another. By the time Elena was in high school, Dmitry and his sons, including Elena's father Mikhail, had pooled their savings and bought a small fabrication shop that made custom metal parts for construction and industrial clients. It was modest but profitable, the kind of business that employed 20 people and generated $2 million in annual revenue, enough to provide comfortable, middle-class lives for the 3 families who owned it. Elena had grown up in that world of practical work and tangible products, where success was measured in contracts fulfilled and invoices paid, where college was considered optional and business school was viewed as a waste of time that could be spent learning the trade. Her cousins Alexei and Dmitry, named for their grandfather in the Russian tradition of keeping names alive across generations, had both gone into the business straight out of high school, learning to operate the machinery, to read technical drawings, to manage client relationships. They were good at it, took pride in it, and assumed Elena would follow the same path or perhaps marry someone in a similar trade and settle into the comfortable ethnic enclave of Russian-American Pittsburgh. But Elena had been different from the beginning, hungry for something beyond the familiar boundaries of family and community. She had gone to Carnegie Mellon despite her family's skepticism about the cost, had majored in computer science despite their confusion about what that even meant, had graduated at 21 with job offers from companies her family had never heard of. She had taken a position at a fintech startup in New York, moving away from Pittsburgh and the family business, and that decision had created the first real fracture in her relationship with the Volkovs. "You think you're too good for us now," her Uncle Victor had said at the going-away dinner they had thrown for her, vodka making his words sharper than perhaps he intended. "You go to fancy school, you move to fancy city, you forget where you come from." It had been framed as a joke, accompanied by laughter and toasts, but Elena had heard the edge underneath, the resentment of someone who saw her choices as implicit criticism of theirs. She had tried to explain that it wasn't about being too good, wasn't about rejection, was simply about pursuing a different kind of opportunity. But the damage was done, the narrative established. At family gatherings over the years that followed, there was always an undercurrent of judgment, a sense that Elena was pretending to be something she wasn't. When she mentioned her work, her cousins would exchange glances that suggested they thought she was exaggerating her importance. When she dressed well, her aunt would make comments about people living beyond their means. When she picked up the check at dinner, her father would mutter about showing off. What none of them knew was that the fintech startup had been acquired by J.P. Morgan Chase when Elena was 24, and her equity package had been worth $4 million. She had rolled that money into investments and joined another startup, this one in cryptocurrency infrastructure, and had done it again, built something valuable, waited for the exit, multiplied her wealth. By 27, she had $15 million. By 30, she had $40 million. By 32, when the cryptocurrency company went public in one of the most successful tech IPOs of the year, she had crossed into 9-figure territory, $130 million in assets, managed by a private wealth firm in Manhattan, diversified across equities, real estate, bonds, and alternative investments. And through it all, she had maintained the fiction of being a well-paid tech worker. She lived in a nice apartment in Manhattan, but nothing ostentatious, wore good clothes but not designer labels that would prompt questions, drove a Lexus when she visited Pittsburgh, because it suggested success without excess. She let her family believe she made a good salary, maybe $200,000 a year, maybe a little more with bonuses. She let them think she was doing fine, comfortable, successful in a modest, white-collar way that they could understand and accept, even if they didn't quite respect it. But the comments had continued, had accumulated over the years into something that felt less like family teasing and more like sustained dismissal. At her cousin Alexei's wedding, when Elena had arrived in a dress that had cost $3,000 but looked simple enough to have come from a department store, her aunt Svetlana had pulled her aside with concern that was half genuine and half performative. "Lenachka, sweetheart, I worry about you. I hear stories about people in New York living on credit cards pretending to be rich. Is everything okay? Do you need help?" The implication had been clear. Elena was living beyond her means, putting on a show, and the family was worried about her inevitable financial collapse. Elena had assured her that everything was fine, that she was being responsible, that there was no cause for concern. But something had shifted in that conversation. Some final tolerance had been exhausted. She had spent a decade allowing her family to underestimate her, to dismiss her, to position her as the family member who had gotten too big for her britches and would eventually learn a hard lesson. And she was tired of it, tired in a way that made her bones ache, tired of protecting their egos at the expense of her own truth. The opportunity had come 6 months later, when her father mentioned at Sunday dinner that the family business was struggling. A major client had gone bankrupt, owing them $200,000, and the loss had created a cash flow crisis. They needed to take out a loan, maybe bring in a partner, something to stabilize the situation. Victor and Mikhail were arguing about the best approach, their voices rising in the familiar pattern of family business disputes where personal and professional conflicts became impossible to separate. "Maybe I could help," Elena had offered quietly, setting down her fork. "I have some savings. I could invest in the company or provide a loan with favorable terms." The laughter had been immediate and cutting. Alexei had actually slapped the table, his face red with mirth. "You? Lena? That's sweet. But we need real money. Like $200,000 minimum, probably more to really stabilize things. We're not talking about a few thousand from your savings account." "I understand the amount," Elena had said, her voice still quiet, still measured. "I'm saying I could help with that." Victor had shaken his head with the patronizing affection of an uncle who thinks his niece is adorable but naive. "Lenachka, you make good salary, yes, I understand. But nobody has $200,000 just sitting around. This is business money, not personal savings. We need real investors or a bank." He had said it kindly, the way you might explain something to a child who doesn't understand how the adult world works. And that had been the moment. Elena had felt something settle in her chest, cold and clear and absolutely certain. She had spent 10 years being patient, being modest, allowing them their illusions. She had done it partly out of genuine humility, partly out of not wanting to change family dynamics, partly out of the immigrant's instinct to stay quiet and avoid drawing attention. But she was done. She was finished allowing people who had built a $2 million fabrication shop to lecture her about what constituted real money. "What if someone wanted to buy the whole company?" she had asked, her tone conversational, as if she were asking about the weather. "What would you value it at?" Her father had looked at her with confusion. "Why do you ask this?" "Curiosity," Elena had said. "You're looking for capital. I'm wondering what the business is worth." Victor had shrugged. "With our contracts, our equipment, our client relationships, maybe 4 million, 4.5. But we're not selling. We're Volkovs. This is family business." He had said it with pride, with the certainty of someone whose identity was tied to ownership of something built across generations. Elena had nodded, filed the number away, and changed the subject. She had finished dinner, had helped clean up, had driven back to New York in her modest Lexus, and then she had called her wealth manager and her attorney and told them she wanted to acquire a manufacturing company in Pittsburgh, and she wanted it done quickly and quietly through a corporate entity that wouldn't immediately reveal her involvement. The process had taken 3 months. Her team had created an acquisition company called Cascade Manufacturing Holdings, nominally based in Delaware, with paperwork that made it look like a standard private equity firm. They had approached Volkov Fabrication through a business broker, expressing interest in acquiring small manufacturing businesses in the region. The initial offer had been $4.2 million, and Elena's father and uncle had dismissed it immediately. They weren't selling. This was family. The offer would have to be dramatically higher to even consider it. So Elena had authorized a second offer, $5.5 million, all cash, with a clause that the current ownership could stay on in management roles with guaranteed salaries and profit sharing. That offer had created the first crack in their resistance. $5.5 million was more than the company was worth by any objective measure, and the Volkov brothers were not so sentimental that they could dismiss that kind of premium. They had started negotiating, had asked for $6 million, had eventually settled on $5.8 million with the management guarantees and a commitment to keep the Volkov name on the building. Elena had followed the negotiations through her attorney, had approved the final terms, had wired the money from her accounts without hesitation. The amount represented roughly 4% of her liquid net worth, a purchase she could make without affecting her lifestyle or long-term financial planning in any meaningful way. The paperwork had been signed on a Thursday afternoon in November, and the Volkov brothers had celebrated what they thought was a victory. They had sold their company for above-market value while maintaining control of operations, had secured their financial futures, had proven they were savvy businessmen who knew how to negotiate. The family dinner that Sunday had been celebratory, vodka flowing freely, toasts to Dimitri's memory and to the family's continued success even as they transitioned from owners to managers. Elena had sat quietly through most of it, waiting for the right moment, and it had come when Victor had raised his glass with tipsy sentimentality. "To family," he had declared, his voice thick with emotion and alcohol. "To staying together even when the world changes. Some people forget where they come from, forget what matters. But we Volkovs, we remember. We stay true." The comment had been directed at her, Elena knew, another small dig at her choices, her life, her perceived pretensions. And she had smiled, had raised her own glass, and had said quietly, "Speaking of the sale, I should probably tell you something about Cascade Manufacturing Holdings." Her father had looked at her with vodka-glazed confusion. "What do you know about this company?" "I am this company," Elena had said, still in that same quiet voice. "I'm the sole owner of Cascade. I bought Volkov Fabrication. I'm your new boss." The silence that had fallen over the table was so complete that Elena could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway, could hear someone's breathing go shallow, could hear the soft sound of her aunt's glass being set down with a hand that had suddenly become unsteady. Faces around the table cycled through expressions too rapidly to track confusion, disbelief, shock, something that might have been anger or might have been fear. "That's not funny," Victor had said finally, his voice hard. "That's not a joke to make, Lena." "It's not a joke," Elena had replied, pulling out her phone and opening her email. She had forwarded the final closing documents to her father's email address. The gesture quiet but definitive. "Check your email. You'll see the ownership structure. Cascade Manufacturing Holdings, LLC. Sole member Elena Mikhailovna Volkov." I signed the final papers on Thursday. Her father had pulled out his own phone with hands that trembled slightly, had opened his email, had read through the documents with growing pallor. He had looked up at his brother, then at Elena, then back at the documents as if they might change if he looked away and back quickly enough. "You bought our company," he said. And it wasn't a question but a statement of fact that he was trying to make real by speaking it aloud. "I bought your company," Elena confirmed, "for $5.8 million, which was a good price. More than fair, actually. Above market value." She had said it the way Victor had always spoken about his business deals, with the casual confidence of someone discussing a transaction they understood completely. Alexei had found his voice, and it came out strangled. "You told us you didn't have money to invest. You said we thought you're just a tech worker. You don't have $6 million. Even in his shock, he was arguing with reality, trying to find an explanation that would restore his understanding of the world. "I'm not just a tech worker," Elena said, and for the first time there was an edge in her voice, a sharpness that cut through the vodka haze and forced attention. "I'm a founding partner at a cryptocurrency infrastructure company that went public last year. I was employee number 7 at a fintech company that was acquired by Chase. Before that, I was at a startup that sold to Google. My net worth is approximately $140 million, give or take, depending on how tech stocks are doing on any given day. $6 million to acquire the family business was well within my budget." The words landed like physical blows. Each number, each company name, each casual revelation hitting with accumulated force. Her aunt Svetlana, who had warned her about living beyond her means, had gone pale. Her cousin Dmitri was staring at her as if she were a stranger, someone he had never met before despite having grown up together. Her father looked stricken, his face showing something between pride and devastation and confusion so profound it seemed to physically pain him. Why? It was her father who asked it, his voice barely above a whisper. Why did you hide this? Why did you let us think? Why did you let us treat you like— He stopped, unable to finish, unable to articulate the magnitude of their miscalculation. Elena had thought about this moment for 3 months, had imagined what she would say, how she would explain. Because I wanted you to see me for who I was, not for what I had. I wanted you to respect my choices, my career, my life. But you never did. Every family gathering, every phone call, there were comments about pretending to be rich, about living beyond my means, about forgetting where I came from. You treated me like I was delusional, like my success was fake, like I needed to learn my place. She paused, letting each word settle. So I decided to show you exactly what I had accomplished. Not by telling you, because you never believed what I said, but by buying the thing you were most proud of, the thing you thought I could never understand or achieve. Your real money business. Victor's face had gone from red to white, the anger and shock cycling into something more complex. This is revenge, he said, the word bitter in his mouth. You bought our company to humiliate us. No, Elena said, and she was surprised to find it was true. I bought your company to save it. You needed capital, needed someone who could invest in modernization, who could access contracts you've been shut out of because you're too small to compete. I can do all of that. I'm going to keep you on in management because you know the business and I don't. I'm going to invest in new equipment, new software, new training. I'm going to help the company grow. She looked at each of them in turn, her voice softening. But I'm also doing it so you would finally see me clearly. Not as the family member who got too big for her britches. Not as someone pretending to be something she's not, but as someone who built something real, something substantial, something that lets me write a $6 million check without blinking. The dinner had ended shortly after that, people making excuses about being tired, needing to get home. The celebratory mood curdled into something awkward and painful. Elena had driven back to New York that night, the Pennsylvania highway dark and empty, and had felt not triumph exactly, but a kind of exhausted relief. She had spent a decade being underestimated, and in one evening she had shattered that illusion so completely it could never be rebuilt. The months that followed had been complicated. Her father had eventually called, had apologized in the halting way of someone unaccustomed to admitting error. They had talked about the business, about her life, about the assumptions he had made and why he had made them. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, wasn't a restoration of what had been broken, but it was something, an acknowledgement, a reckoning, a beginning of understanding. Victor had been slower to come around, his pride more wounded. But eventually he too had accepted the new reality and even begun to appreciate the investments Elena was making in the company. The business had grown under her ownership, revenue doubling in 2 years as Elena brought in new clients, modernized operations, and leveraged her network in ways the Volkovs never could have. She visited Pittsburgh monthly, walked through the shop floor, talked to employees, learned about the work in ways she never had growing up. The Volkov name stayed on the building, but the company transformed, became something larger and more sophisticated while retaining the core competencies that had made it successful. Perhaps revenge is not always about destruction or humiliation, but about forcing people to confront the gap between their perceptions and reality. The Volkov family had spent years telling Elena to stop pretending to be rich, to accept her place, to stop putting on airs. They had said it with concern and mockery and patronizing affection, never imagining that their words were landing on someone who had quietly built wealth that exceeded their comprehension. And when Elena had finally revealed the truth, not through words, but through the undeniable act of purchasing their company, she had given them a gift, though they might not have seen it that way at first. She had given them the opportunity to see her clearly, to understand what they had missed, to recalibrate their understanding of success and capability, and who gets to define what constitutes achievement. The truth about family is that we assign each other roles based on incomplete information and then resist updating those roles even when evidence contradicts them. Elena had been cast as the family member who left, who thought she was better, who would eventually learn that the world was harder than she imagined, and she had allowed that casting for years, had lived quietly within their limited vision of her, until the day she decided that their comfort with that fiction mattered less than her need to be seen. The acquisition had been expensive. $6 million is real money, even for someone with $140 million, but it had purchased something more valuable than ownership of a manufacturing company. It had purchased truth, clarity, the end of pretending to be less than she was. And out there, in family businesses and dining rooms and holiday gatherings across the country, countless others are living beneath the estimations of people who think they know them, who have decided what they're capable of, who will be shocked to learn that the quiet relative has built empires in silence. Those revelations are coming, patient and inevitable, for everyone who has been told to stop pretending, to know their place, to accept the limited story others have written for their lives. And when those moments arrive, when the supposedly struggling relative buys the company, when the overlooked sibling turns out to be the most successful, when the person who was told to be realistic turns out to have redefined what realistic means, they will carry the same mixture of satisfaction and sadness that Elena felt that Sunday evening in Pittsburgh. The satisfaction of being finally, undeniably seen. The sadness that it required such a dramatic gesture to achieve what should have been freely given. Respect, belief, the acknowledgement that people are capable of more than we imagine, especially those we think we know best.